You people were never meant to sit at that table. The words cut through the boardroom air like glass shattering. Eyes darted toward Imani in silent agreement, pretending the phrase hadn't echoed through the space like an open slap. The speaker, Harold Voss, Senior Director of Operations at Selbridge International, didn't even flinch after saying it. He leaned back in his chair, smug, lips pressed into a thin line, as if challenging anyone to object. Imani Ad-I, me 31, black, brilliant, and newly promoted to interim VP of Strategy, sat frozen in her tailored charcoal suit, fingers tight around the edge of her tablet. Her skin burned with a heat that came from deeper than anger. It was humiliation disguised as professionalism. She scanned the room. Not a single person looked her in the eye. Cowards in pressed suits, all of them. She had known this place was poisonous, but she hadn't expected it to be so bold, so open in its contempt. Her promotion had been quietly resented. No one said it out loud, but she heard it between the lines. She was the diversity face, a PR gesture during Selbridge's forced equity audit. She wasn't supposed to last. Harold cleared his throat. We'll reconvene this discussion tomorrow when we've had a chance to rework the projections. Appropriately, a final jab. Meeting adjourned. As chairs scraped and murmurs resumed, Imani stood slowly, her limbs stiff. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought someone might hear it. She walked out, heels clicking like gunshots in the hallway. In the elevator, she exhaled. Finally, alone. She didn't cry. She never cried here. Not for them. Imani had come from nowhere they respected. South Side Chicago, raised by her grandmother while her mother worked 3 jobs. She'd fought for every inch, graduated top of her class at Spelman, MBA from Wharton. But still, here, none of it mattered. To them, she was an imposter, a guest overstaying her welcome. She arrived back at her glass-walled office, paused, and closed the door behind her. Don't give them the show, she whispered to herself. She opened her laptop, pulled up the project Harold had so easily dismissed, a restructuring plan that would reduce executive redundancy and redirect funding to grassroots outreach and urban hiring programs. It threatened people like him, executives who'd made entire careers out of bloated budgets and opaque bonus structures. He didn't just oppose the plan. He feared it. And Imani knew fear made people dangerous. That night, Imani sat alone at her kitchen counter, the hum of the refrigerator her only companion. Her inbox was full of follow-ups from other directors, each one subtly questioning her projections, casting doubt on her model. The tone was uniform, overly polite, condescending, and completely devoid of trust. She opened one attachment. It was her own spreadsheet, but edited. Figures changed. Assumptions distorted. Sabotage. She stared at the file, rage bubbling just beneath her skin. Not even subtle. They were trying to discredit her work before the next board meeting. And if she challenged it too harshly, they'd call her emotional, unprofessional. There was only one way forward. She'd prove it. Every number, every formula, every decision. Not just to survive, but to make them answer for every lie they whispered behind locked doors. The next morning, she walked into HR under the guise of a benefits question. Vanessa, the HR manager, was a soft-spoken white woman who always smiled too long. I just need access logs for the finance folder, Imani said. Last 48 hours. I think someone made changes to a shared file. Vanessa hesitated. Is there an issue? I'm not sure yet, Imani lied. But if someone outside my department made edits, I'll need it documented for the quarterly compliance review, Vanessa nodded. Of course, within 10 minutes, Imani had what she needed. Harold's name, time-stamped, with metadata showing he'd accessed and saved over her file from his home IP at midnight. They were so sure she wouldn't fight back. So sure she wouldn't be smart enough to cover herself. She copied the logs to a private drive, then opened a new folder. Proof, she whispered. Let's collect. Over the next 3 days, she became invisible. Not weak invisible. She spoke only when spoken to, nodded politely, let them believe they were winning. Meanwhile, she documented everything. Conversations, messages, altered documents, misappropriated files. And something even more interesting, an internal audit report from the year before that had mysteriously disappeared from the system. It detailed executive bonus irregularities. She found it in the archive by searching obsolete file extensions. It was damning. Millions funneled into discretionary loyalty bonuses to top execs, Harold included, during a year when the company had claimed budget cuts and denied raises to entry-level employees. The hypocrisy was systemic. It wasn't just Harold, it was the culture. This wasn't just her battle. It was a reckoning. At the final board presentation, the room was full. Leather chairs, polished oak table, 10 board members flown in. Imani stood at the end of the room alone. She wore black sharp, severe, intentional. Harold sat across from her, arms folded, smug again. The presentation began. Imani spoke clearly, walking through the projections and proposals with surgical precision. She watched them squirm when the new hiring plan showed a 23% return over 5 years, backed by third-party economic models. But then Harold raised his hand. These numbers have already been flagged as manipulated, he said calmly. It's unfortunate, but I think we need to question the reliability of this proposal. He smiled, eyes narrowed like a predator who'd already fed. Imani smiled back. Actually, she said, turning the screen to the board, I anticipated that. She clicked. The screen changed. Metadata logs. Comparison files. A timeline. Silence. Mr. Voss accessed and altered the proposal file at 12:08 a.m. on July 14th, she said. These changes were not authorized, nor were they acknowledged. I've provided a complete version history to the compliance team. Gasps. One board member stood. Harold's face went pale. And one more thing, Imani added, her voice steady. During my review, I recovered an internal audit report deleted from public access last year. It contains evidence of financial misconduct that predates my tenure, but that certainly aligns with the current resistance to structural reform. Now every eye in the room was on her. Harold stood up. This is outrageous. You're twisting data? No, she interrupted. I'm exposing it. She slid a printed copy of the audit across the table. I'm making this public. If this board chooses to ignore it, I'll take it outside, a threat, a promise. And she meant every word. The room fractured. Some board members leaned back in their chairs, blinking slowly like they'd just been splashed with cold water. Others flipped through the printed audit with frantic fingers, scanning for keywords that could connect them, implicate them. No one spoke. Not at first. Harold stood frozen, his confidence shattered. He looked down at the papers as if they'd betrayed him personally. Then the board chair, Miss Evelyn Rowe, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s with silver hair that seemed as precise as her tone, finally broke the silence. Miss Adiemi, she said, voice neutral. How long have you been compiling this? Since the day after my promotion, Imani replied. The opposition wasn't professional. It was personal. And I wanted to understand why. Why didn't you come to the board sooner? Imani's gaze was direct. Because I had no reason to believe you would listen to me without proof. She didn't blink. Neither did Evelyn. A pause passed like a knife's edge. Then Evelyn nodded once, slowly. Continue. Imani resumed the presentation, but this time it was no longer a proposal. It was a prosecution. Slide after slide detailed inconsistencies in executive reporting, patterns of retaliatory behavior against non-white hires, gendered performance assessments, charts, timelines, receipts. She showed how bonuses were issued despite budget cuts, how hiring freezes were disproportionately applied to departments with diverse leadership, how reports of harassment were routed through informal review panels that led to no action. She ended with a quote from the company's own equity statement, published 3 years earlier. Integrity means more than compliance. It means courage, accountability, action. She looked up. I'm not here to be your token. I'm here to change this place. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Silence followed. Then murmurs, uneasy glances. But it was Evelyn who spoke again. Mr. Voss, please step out of the room. Harold opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned and walked out stiffly, as if gravity had suddenly tripled. The door clicked shut behind him. Evelyn folded her hands. We'll take a 10-minute recess. Imani didn't move. She stood alone as the others filed out. Alone, but not small. She had cracked the foundation. Now it was time to make it crumble. Outside the boardroom, Harold was waiting. He stood near the hallway windows, arms crossed. When he saw Imani emerge, he straightened. You think you've won something? He hissed. Imani stopped beside him, calm. I think I stopped you from stealing from people who've earned every cent they never got. You're naive, he snapped. You think this company cares about you? About any of them? These people survive by protecting their own. She stepped closer. So do I. He stared at her, like he was seeing her for the first time. Not as a junior, not as a threat, but as something worse. A mirror. Proof that intelligence, discipline, and fire didn't belong to the elite. That power could rise from places they refused to look. You'll never last, he muttered. She smiled. We'll see. By the end of the week, Harold Voss was on a sabbatical. Internally, everyone knew it was a soft exit. Externally, the company gave a vague press release thanking him for many years of strategic leadership. The board wasn't ready for public blood yet. But the message had been sent. Imani had a new meeting on her calendar. Ethics and Reform Committee formation phase. Not just an invite. A chair. She took it. Inside the company, winds shifted slowly, then with speed. Directors who had whispered their doubts about Imani suddenly wanted to collaborate. Department heads sent her tentative requests to revisit stalled initiatives. HR reopened past complaints some dismissed for years and started reviewing them under new criteria. But the most startling change was the internal chatter. A junior engineer, Asian American, barely 24, left a post-it on Imani's office door that read, "Thank you for not walking away." Another, a Latina woman from payroll, stopped her in the elevator. "They used to laugh at us behind closed doors," she said. "Now they pause when we walk in." Imani didn't respond. She just nodded. She knew this wasn't victory. It was only the first crack in a wall that had taken generations to build. And walls don't fall overnight. She still had enemies. Not all of them were loud. Some worked in quiet, careful ways, shifting budget lines, burying reports in unreadable formats, inviting her to meetings just to waste her time. But now she had allies too. People were watching. One morning, a compliance analyst named Jordan approached her. White, young, clearly nervous. "I found something," he said, sliding into the seat across from her in the caf. "Go on, it's the hiring database." There's a duplicate field that doesn't show in most reports, hidden with conditional formatting. It tracks cultural risk. Imani blinked. Cultural risk. He nodded. That's what it's labeled. It flags applicants from certain zip codes, certain colleges, even extracurriculars. It calculates the risk of ideological disruption. She stared at him. It's a racism filter. He nodded, pale. That's my guess. She sat back, stunned, but not surprised. Another rot exposed. Can you prove it? I pulled the script from the back end. It's buried. But it's there. Send it to me. Securely, he nodded and left, glancing over his shoulder. That night, she sat at home reading the code. It was elegant, quiet, evil. It gave a numeric value to traits considered culturally disruptive, HCU graduates, applicants with activist experience, applicants who had gaps in employment consistent with family leave or mental health breaks. All flagged. Not blocked, but downgraded. Subtly. Enough to be explained away. It wasn't just Harold. It wasn't even just Selbridge. It was a system. One designed to preserve whiteness, compliance, and the illusion of merit. She thought about the janitor she saw every morning, who smiled at her like she was someone. She thought about the single moms in payroll, the coders from Detroit, the receptionists with side hustles and student debt. This place was never built for them, but it was about to be rebuilt. Imani didn't leak the code to the press. Not yet. She brought it to the Ethics and Reform Committee instead. With a single slide, buried beneath layers of reporting, she said, is a script that punishes applicants for being different from the dominant culture. It doesn't say race or gender, but it knows. It's mathematical discrimination. Someone tried to interrupt. She didn't let them. This isn't about compliance. This is about values. What kind of company are we rebuilding if we keep silent about the tools that built it wrong? There were no counter-arguments, only questions, and a slow collective breath of shame. A week later, Selbridge made headlines. Fortune 100 firm uncovers bias algorithm in hiring system, internal reform underway. This story was carefully curated, the press statements neutral. But people noticed the real headline. A black woman had found the flaw, and named it, and stayed. The news coverage was polished, cautious, and superficial. Phrases like algorithmic misalignment and unintentional oversight softened the truth for public digestion. But inside Selbridge, no one was fooled. They knew exactly what it had been. Racism. Systemic, coded, and conveniently deniable. Imani walked through the office 2 days after the article hit. The energy was different. Eyes followed her, some with admiration, some with fear, and some with resentment so sharp it left the air colder in its wake. One of the senior analysts she passed muttered the word troublemaker under his breath. She didn't stop. She had no time for ghosts. That afternoon, an internal email leaked. An anonymous message sent to upper management. No subject line. No signature. If we reward rebellion, we will lose control. Loyalty must matter more than optics. She is not building this company, she is dismantling it. The implication was clear. Imani was the target, but she smiled when she read it, because now they were scared. She forwarded it to IT for a trace and included it in her private documentation folder. She knew better than to believe exposure was the same as resolution. Systems don't fall with truth alone. They fall when the truth becomes undeniable and when someone dares to hold a mirror to power long enough for the cracks to spread. 1 week later, Imani stood before the full board again. This time, the room was packed. Reporters were downstairs. Employees lined the atrium floors watching via stream. A handful of junior staff had even brought their children somehow, knowing something larger was at play. Imani's task wasn't just procedural anymore. It was symbolic. "I want to thank the board for granting this session," she began. Her voice was calm, resonant. "After recent events, the Reform Committee has compiled a set of actionable recommendations. Not suggestions, actions. With timelines," she clicked to the first slide. "A new hiring framework, one that prioritized transparency, community partnerships, and blind review practices." Then the next. A full audit of executive bonuses over the past decade, with retroactive caps and mandatory reinvestment into underfunded departments. And another. A whistleblower protection clause independently governed. One by one, she laid out the blueprints for a new institution, one that wouldn't just perform equity, but embody it. Some of the board looked pained, others intrigued, and a few nodded with quiet, growing respect. Then she reached the final slide and paused. "I'm also proposing an internal restitution initiative." Gasps. Murmurs. "Yes," she continued, unwavering. "This company profited from discriminatory systems for years through hiring biases, withheld promotions, and suppressed complaints. That harm has a cost. And that cost needs to be acknowledged not with apologies, but with correction." An older man in a navy suit raised his hand. "And who determines the amount? Who decides what is owed?" Imani looked straight at him. "Those who were denied." Silence. Then Evelyn Rose spoke from the end of the table. "Your proposals are bold, Miss Adeyemi." Imani nodded. "They're overdue." That night, she didn't sleep. She stayed at her desk, surrounded by half-finished mugs of coffee and open spreadsheets, trying to quiet the unease beneath her ribs. Victory always comes with backlash. And she could feel it in the silence of her inbox, in the absence of calls where there should have been chaos. They were regrouping, plotting, and she couldn't afford to blink. 2 days later, the first blow came. An anonymous tip was sent to a gossip site with screenshots of Imani's social media from college of protests she'd led against corporate recruiters on campus. She'd held a sign that read, "Capitalism is violence." The headline wrote itself. VP behind Selbridge shakeup once called capitalism violence within hours. Conservative outlets picked it up. By noon, her inbox was flooded with hate mail. By PM, a protest formed outside the building organized by a group calling themselves True Merit. They carried signs too. No political agendas. Merit over quotas. Imani equals instability. She watched from the window, face unreadable. It wasn't a surprise. It was a pattern. First, question her ideas. Then, question her right to belong. And when that fails, question her past. But she didn't flinch. She printed the article, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same folder that held her proof, her numbers, her plans. Let them come. Later that week, the company held a town hall. Every employee was invited. The atrium was full. The CEO, a silent and largely ceremonial figurehead named Alan Royce, stepped up to the mic first. He gave a bland statement about evolving times and listening to voices before quickly ceding the stage. Then Evelyn Rowe stood up. "This company has failed to reflect the world we profit from," she said. "And we cannot hide behind the market while people suffer under our structures." Then she did something no one expected. She turned to Imani and stepped aside. "Miss Adeyemi, you have the floor." Imani rose, slowly, deliberately, and stepped into history. "I've heard the criticisms," she began, "that I'm pushing too hard. That I'm turning Selbridge into something unrecognizable. She looked around at the crowd. Some hostile, some hopeful. They're right. She let that sit. This company should be unrecognizable. It should be new. Just. Reflective of the people who keep it alive, who clean its floors, code its software, manage its accounts, deliver its packages, answer its phones. For too long, we've built monuments to a few and prisons for the rest. Someone clapped. Then another. Imani continued. I'm not interested in stability. I'm interested in truth. And truth is uncomfortable, especially for those who've never had to live with the consequences of their comfort. Now the room was listening. All I've done, every number, every change, every leak you think I caused, I did with one goal: justice. Not performative, not symbolic. Real. She paused. I won't apologize for demanding it. Thunderous applause. Real. Raw. Even some of the critics stood. Not because they agreed, but because they recognized power when it showed up without flinching. The applause echoed into the hallways, down the elevator shafts, through the glass walls that once made Imani feel exposed. Now they made her visible. 2 days later, the board voted. Of the 13 recommendations Imani had proposed, 11 passed unanimously. 1 passed with a narrow margin. Only 1 failed. The restitution initiative. The vote was 6-7. Imani wasn't surprised. She expected their silence to stretch just a little longer when it came to reparations. Accountability, after all, was easier when it didn't come with a price tag. Still, she marked that vote in red on her personal log. Not as a loss, but as unfinished business. The resistance shifted underground. Emails arrived with vague delays. Budget approvals that once took 48 hours began taking weeks. Her access to certain datasets was mysteriously revoked. Rumors circulated that she was planning to sue the company, that she was being watched. Classic tactics. Imani knew that when you fight a machine, it doesn't scream. It slows down. It jams. It waits for you to tire out. But she didn't. Instead, she trained others. She started mentoring a small group of employees across departments, mostly women, mostly black and brown, queer, first generation. Not in secret, but not on company record either. They called themselves the bench because one day they planned to take the field. One of them, Layla, a brilliant systems analyst from Detroit, brought her something late one Friday night. It was a compliance archive from the year before Imani joined the company. Inside was an old HR complaint, dismissed within 24 hours. The complainant was a black woman named Dina Caldwell, mid-level product lead, Ivy League degree, spotless record. Her complaint alleged that her project had been stolen by a white male peer and rebranded under his name just weeks before she was passed over for promotion. The attached documentation was clear. She had evidence, receipts, screenshots, her supervisor's approval on the original draft. The case was closed due to lack of substantiation. 3 weeks after the dismissal, Dina left the company. No farewell message, no press, just disappeared. Imani stared at the file long after Layla had gone. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. Imani contacted Dina through a mutual connection. The woman was cautious at first, hesitant. But after an hour on a video call, after Imani showed her what had changed and what hadn't, she agreed to meet in person. They talked for 4 hours in a small cafe off 7th Avenue. Dina shared more than her story. She shared her files. All of them. She had kept it all just in case. And now she handed it over. Imani asked her one question before they left. Are you ready for your name to be known again? Dina smiled. I've been ready since the day they tried to erase me. The following week, Imani made her move. She scheduled a company-wide webinar under the title, Reckoning and Rebuilding, the Hidden Histories of Selbridge. No one knew what to expect. Most thought it would be a corporate review or some watered-down day seminar. But when the stream began, and Dina Caldwell's face appeared on the screen beside Imani's, the air in the building changed. Imani didn't waste time. She told Dina's story. With evidence. With names. With timelines. With screenshots. The chat box exploded. So did the media. This time, the truth wasn't buried in internal memos. It was public. Live. Undeniable. Selbridge tried to control the narrative. They issued a statement calling Dina's case a past oversight by a no longer employed individual and reaffirmed their commitment to equity, but the public didn't buy it. Because the culture had already changed. Internally, dozens of employees submitted reports within days, revived complaints, newly documented patterns of abuse, stories that had lived in whispers and fear. Imani worked with HR to build a temporary review task force that included employees from outside management. The board resisted, but Evelyn Rowe didn't. She backed Imani. And when other companies began facing scrutiny for similar histories, Selbridge realized something it hadn't before. This wasn't bad press. This was leadership. This was the future knocking at the door, and Imani was the only one with the courage to open it. A month later, restitution passed. Not as a pity program, not as PR, as policy. Retroactive bonuses, career reinstatement offers, public acknowledgments of harm, dedicated mental health support, transparent appeals process for all HR decisions moving forward. Dina was the first name officially recognized. Her title retroactively applied, Director of Product Strategy. Her LinkedIn profile simply read, I never stopped being who they tried to erase. Imani stood on the rooftop that night. The city below pulls with neon and ambition, the concrete heartbeat of a system slowly learning to hear itself. She closed her eyes, let the air fill her lungs. Not peace, but purpose. She thought of her grandmother, who raised her with stories of dignity won in quiet revolutions. She thought of the little girl watching the live stream from her mother's laptop in some distant zip code, wondering if she too could sit at a table like that one day and not be told she didn't belong. And she thought of the words that started it all. You people were never meant to sit at that table, she smiled. Because now, she wasn't just sitting at the table. She was redesigning it. And when she was done, it would have no head. Just seats. For everyone. 6 months later, Selbridge looked nothing like the company that had tried to break her. The bench Imani had mentored. 5 of them now held managerial roles. 2 had been fast-tracked into director training. And one Layla was rewriting the very code that once filtered out people like her. A new HR framework was in place, transparent, monitored, accountable. Complaints couldn't be dismissed without a paper trail, and employees now had the right to appeal decisions through an external equity board. A policy Imani had named the Dina Clause. Not everyone celebrated. Some quietly transferred out. Others clung to the old culture like driftwood in a rising tide. But the company didn't sink. It evolved. Slowly. Uncomfortably. But it evolved. One morning, Imani received a package. No return address. Inside, a photo in a black frame. It was a boardroom. Old. Faded. All white men. On the back, a note written in cursive ink. They built the table. You burned the blueprint. Don't stop now. There was no signature. She hung the photo on her office wall, right next to a quote from Audre Lorde. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, but Imani hadn't used their tools. She built her own, and used them like a scalpel. She received offers, high-paying ones, consulting firms, policy institutes, even an informal invitation to join a task force for the Department of Labor. Each email came with polished language, curious compliments, and veiled flattery. "We need minds like yours. You'd be perfect for reshaping public strategy. You belong at the top." But Imani didn't want to be at the top. She wanted to change how the world even defined top. So she said no to all of them, and stayed. When the fiscal year ended, Selbridge released its first full transparency report. Real data. Not just diversity percentages, but retention, promotion parity, wage equity. The results weren't perfect, but they were honest, and that mattered more. Imani refused to be a mascot for reform. She stayed in the data, the documents, the decisions. She insisted every public success be matched with internal transformation. One journalist called her the reluctant revolutionary. She preferred a different term. Architect. Not of systems as they were, but of systems that could be. Then, one cold morning in December, something unexpected happened. She was offered the CEO seat. Official. Permanent. She read the offer 3 times. Not because she didn't believe it, but because, deep down, she wasn't sure if she wanted it. Power at the top of a broken system is still power built on rubble. And she had spent too long digging others out of the debris to forget that. But then she walked through the office that day and saw a mural on the mezzanine wall, painted by interns. It showed a black woman standing at a table long, wooden, with many empty seats. Around her stood people of every kind, smiling, waiting. The caption, "A place for us all." She accepted the position, not for the title, but for the blueprint. In her first address as CEO, Imani wore no makeup, no styled hair, no rehearsed speech. She stood before the company, her voice steady, her hands visible. "I was told once I didn't belong at the table," she began. "And maybe I didn't." Pause. "Because the table itself was never built for people like me. Or you. Or most of us." She looked out at the audience, more diverse now, more real. "So I didn't just fight to sit here. I fought to rebuild what here means." Applause. But she raised a hand. "Not applause yet. Not until this place reflects the communities we touch, the labor we depend on, and the futures we claim to support." She leaned forward, calm and fierce. "Power is not given. It's practiced. And we will practice it differently." She ended with a promise not of perfection, but of presence. "We will fail forward. Together." Loudly, and this time, when they clapped, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of fire. Years from now, people would write about Imani Adeyemi. They would call her the first black woman to lead a Fortune 100 company through radical internal justice. They would analyze her strategies, teach her decisions in business schools, debate her reforms on podcasts and panels. But the truest version of her legacy would live in quieter places. In a young queer coder from Oakland who finally saw someone like them at the helm. In a receptionist who was no longer overlooked. In the janitor who received back pay and a real apology. In Dina Caldwell's reinstated pension. In the burning away of silence. In the rising of something better. Not a miracle. Not a moment. A movement. And Imani? She never called herself a hero. She just said, "They built a system. I built a mirror, and made them look